Welcome to our Curious Amalgam, the weekly podcast brought to you by the Antitrust Law section of the American Bar Association. Our Curious Amalgam explores the fascinating and increasingly overlapping world of competition, consumer protection, data protection, and privacy law. Each week, we bring you leading global experts on the most compelling issues of the day. Enjoy the show.
Hello, and welcome to our Curious Amalgam, the podcast from the American Bar Association Antitrust Law section. My name is Christina Ma, and today's topic is, have we figured it out? Online privacy and security in the new normal of video conferencing. Although video conferencing technology has been around for years, there's no question it has become central to our work and social lives in the last year and likely for the years to come. In today's episode, we explore what we've learned about the use of video conferencing in schools, workplaces, and other aspects of life that have gone virtual, and what challenges we still face when it comes to online privacy and security. Joining me today is my co-host, Kayla Odom. Hi, Kayla.
Hi, Christina.
Welcome back.
Thanks.
So what are we hoping to get out of today's episode?
Well, in the early stages of this Zoom boom, we saw so many different types of problems, starting from just getting people connected and familiar with the technology. And then once we got people set up, the issues that we saw really varied. And even though this is not new technology, video conferencing is widely being used now in a variety of settings, including very sensitive and confidential conversations in workplaces, in government, private conversations with doctors, but also in schools and in, everyday family conversations. So what we want to talk about today is, where are we now in terms of the type of issues we're seeing from a privacy, cybersecurity, and possibly even a competition perspective when it comes to using video conferencing platforms? What are possible solutions to the issues or best practices for use of video conferencing technology? There's a lot we've learned collectively in the past year, but there are still some concerns and the possibility of more problems to come. So today we're hoping to take a closer look at these issues.
Great, Kayla. And who do we have as our guests today?
Our guests today are Claudia Rast and David Turetsky. Both of our highly distinguished guests come from they're longtime ABA leaders, and both have served on the ABA's Presidential Cybersecurity Legal Task Force. Claudia Rast is a shareholder of Butzel Long, based in Ann Arbor, and is the practice department chair of the Intellectual Property, Cybersecurity, and Emerging Technology Group. In addition to serving on the Cybersecurity Legal Task Force, Claudia was the chair of the ABA's section of Environment, Energy, and Resources, and she has published extensively on issues involving cybersecurity, privacy, and environmental law. David Turetsky is a professor of practice at the College of Emergency Preparedness, Homeland Security, and Cybersecurity at the University of Albany. David previously co-led the cybersecurity, privacy, and data protection practice at Aiken Gump and served as the chief of the Public Safety and Homeland Security Bureau, where he led cybersecurity policy for the Federal Communications Commission. And he's also served as a deputy assistant attorney general for the Antitrust Division of the Department of Justice. So, Claudia, David, welcome to the program.
Thank you.
Thank you.
You've gone through the real alphabet soup, Kayla.
Yes. So let's jump right in. How would you both describe some of the earlier problems we saw with the increased use of video conferencing? David, how about we start with you?
Well, I think that it was an unexpected demand, right? The scale and suddenness of the switch to working at home was dramatic and exponential due to COVID. And it resulted in a big challenge. People were using tools that they were not familiar with. They were working with devices and from places that they didn't customarily do. And so it really called on people to learn new kinds of skills to use those devices and services. And the services themselves, I think, were a bit overwhelmed initially by that increased demand. You know, when law firms design their security systems, they are very careful about anticipating what will be done remotely, what will be done locally, how to build a security perimeter, how to control access. And all of a sudden in the COVID era, everybody was working remotely, regardless of expertise. And that put an unusual amount of demand and stress on the video conferencing systems. And it took them a while in some cases to be able to improve their services to meet the standards of that new flood of users.
That's certainly true. Things really happened fast. And I guess I wanted to ask you, since you're a professor, like, what would you say was the hardest challenge in the school setting of getting school to be virtual and getting that to work?
Well, I think the first challenge was for the professors. I think the students, in terms of, college age students, were in some sense more adept with technology than the community around them. On the other hand, they weren't necessarily used to using it. Certainly we had remote learning, we had online education, but the challenge of getting undergrads to all use the same link at the right time and preserve it, was a bit of an issue. But, in terms of how that's affected security, there were instances of Zoom bombing, if you will, in early classes where somebody who was not a member of the class joined and disrupted. And so that was something that had to be worked out, both in Zoom increasing security settings and also the university and professors learning how to do that. There was a really interesting study, Kayla, that came out in early February of 2021 that was reported on in Wired magazine. And what it underscored is that some of the cybersecurity threats, especially in high schools and in colleges, to video conferencing are classic insider threats, as we say. And insider threats are when people who are trusted in some sense, they're either the students or employees or contractors, have and are given access to those video conferencing tools, to an organization's systems. They may either wittingly or unwittingly open up to cyber attack. And that is what this remarkable academic study showed, that while it was assumed that Zoom bombing incidents where intruders join and disrupt were coming from the outside, actually a significant number of those instances originated from the inside with the participants, with students or others, putting information out on the web or sharing it in texts or otherwise with others, either because they didn't like the class and really wanted it disrupted, or there was a racial or political end to it or whatever. And a significant number of those Zoom bombing incidents turned out to be insider incidents in their origination.
Oh, I wonder how you can, protect against insider abuse. I mean, we're so focused on protecting against outsiders coming in, but I mean, that's a whole nother level of the problem. I wonder if there's anything you can do to target that sort of activity or to hold people accountable in that situation.
Well, it's a challenge. And that's true throughout cybersecurity, whether it has to do with video conferencing, whether it has to do with the COVID era, or just the pre-existing challenges, as Claudia knows, and we've talked about. The insider threat, if you will, is a potent one in the world of cybersecurity. It always is. It's, like I say, it can be the unintended consequence of well-meaning employees clicking on the wrong site, downloading the wrong thing, being fooled in some way by a phishing exploit, or it can be malicious. And the instances I'm talking about are malicious in the sense that students have played a role in some cases in the roots of the Zoom bombing.
Claudia, what would you say was the biggest problem in the last year that we saw with respect to video conferencing? And do you think that problem has sort of been figured out by now?
Well, it's a dynamic problem because it always seems to be changing. But to go where David was talking before, when you take a platform, Zoom, for example, that in December 2019 had maybe 10 million users and 4 months later had 300 million, that's a tremendous bump, obviously, in the number of users. There were a lot of platforms out there, some that I am very familiar with in dealing with forensic and cybersecurity issues and dealing with the forensic experts. And I know and operate on secure platforms with access control and two-factor authentication. And those have been around for a long time and are still there and are still used for those kinds of secure issues. But to the point where you're taking the working population and the student educator population and throwing them all out remotely at the same time, that put tremendous stress on not only the platforms, but on the technological prowess of those using the platforms, which we encounter that as attorneys, throwing all attorneys all of a sudden as basically solo practitioners in their homes, where they're not able to yell out into the hallway for someone to come help them. You just say, it's that button. No, I'm sorry. That takes a little more of a struggle to get there. So, we had one instance and changed our video meeting platform early on in the pandemic because the platform that we had been using limited users to 9 squares. So we would have 50 some lawyers for meetings. And if you're not among the first 9 to join the meeting, no one's going to see you. And that created great strife among those who were, not quite on time, or maybe not as early as they should have been to get their square up there. But, in terms of the security, and the interesting thing, and David and I have had these discussions too on Zoom. The good news and the bad news for Zoom was that they were subjected to this FTC enforcement action based on activities in 2016. Had those not taken place and had the efforts not been there for Zoom to meet those kind of security and privacy requirements that were basically rolled out during the pandemic, Zoom might have been a very different platform today. And of course, we have that FTC enforcement action that was the settlement announced last November and was recently finalized, although not by unanimous vote. And to that insider, there's an interesting thing with the dissenting vote among the FTC, the commissioners, relating to a Zoom rogue employee whistleblower in China who indicated, I have access to those supposedly encrypted recorded meetings. And so it goes to that wonderful yin and yang and tension between security and privacy. And we can, have that discussion a bit too, and what security is in the safeguarding of the data, and privacy is where we're safeguarding the identity of the person. And sometimes the two do not, there's some tension there. I think that's something that we can chat about too.
Just stepping back, I just had a technical question. Is it more difficult to encrypt and secure video conferencing platforms versus phone conferencing platforms, which have been around for a very long time? And I feel like they've sort of figured out the security for that.
It's an interesting question, Christina, because I've had this debate internally where trying to get full disk encryption and file management encryption and so forth into law firms. And there will be this hue and cry saying it will it'll slow down access. It'll take too long. It's too difficult. We can't do it. It's too expensive. Most of those arguments have gone away. The technology and the capabilities and the it's like faster, better, cheaper. The technology is advanced, so that kind of encryption capabilities, it's not the impediment that it used to be. So, I mean, can you tell on a Zoom that the fact that it's encrypted now as opposed to when it might not have been encrypted? I don't think so. I mean, that's not perceptible to the average human. Maybe there are those of us who are not human that can notice these things.
That's another thing I wanted to ask about is transparency and these companies and the platforms. Are they being more transparent with users? Perhaps after Zoom was investigated by the FTC. Is there more transparency from Zoom and all the other companies? Are they being upfront with the terms and conditions when it comes to data storage and data collection? Like, do you think the average user would be able to find information if they wanted to?
Well, you have, interestingly enough, and at the same time this pandemic hit, you have things like the California Consumer Privacy Act, followed by proposed legislation in Alabama recently, as well as Virginia, as well as the state of Washington, and as well as New York. And so those kinds of, it used to be, data breach laws, right? That was the big thing, that you got notified when your information was floating out there in the Never Land. Now the laws that we're seeing are requiring consumer protection, identity protection, required notice upon collection. So companies are having to provide the kind of information they collect, how they use it, and they can't use it for a purpose that they haven't told you about. And it's a very interesting situation with the California CCPA, because it's kind of the tail wagging the dog. We're all having to comply with California because it's such a big consumer state. I don't know that people really pay attention to those privacy notices, but there are certain notification requirements upon collection that are required. And I'm sure, David, you have some thoughts there.
Yeah, I'd like to follow up on your invitation about, I don't know whether people pay attention to those privacy disclosures. I'm a big believer, Kayla, in the notion that disclosure is a valuable thing, but it's a tool with limits. I don't think that my students know what happens with Zoom recordings or what the implications of using Zoom are. And if I schedule a class on Zoom, they don't have a choice, even if they, get to check, something that says, I know this is being recorded or whatever. I generally don't record my my courses if I can avoid it. I don't do it when there are controversial issues involved. I want 20-year-olds to be candid, and I want a good discussion, and I don't want their words to necessarily live on in posterity, to potentially be used or abused. And I was told early on not to worry too much about the privacy piece. It won't be used a certain way. And then just after that, there was a litigation initiated in light of the COVID era, a class action by students. It may have been national, I don't know. And the claim was that they were due refunds because the quality of education was lower once it began to be remote. And so we were told that there was a litigation hold, and all of our documents and our recordings needed to be held. So whatever assurances, we were given, whatever expectations there were, went out the window at that point, to me, in some fashion. And I happen to believe that that disclosure is way overrated, because the reality is most people don't understand what those disclosures say. In online commerce in general, they are so vague and, protective of the company's discretion to deal with unknown, numbers of companies and in different capacities. And especially if you combine that with market power, And, you may need to think about market power differently, because when you're confronted by the choice of going to class or not, there's a lot of market power that's not necessarily reflective of, whether Microsoft Teams is a choice, whether Zoom is a choice. None of the other ones are a choice at that time. So I think that, that consumer protection needs to go way beyond disclosure in situations like that. And, it's an area where I think that regulators may have, an important role.
You're right, David. And it points out that tension between privacy and security. I mean, what you're doing may be secure, but is there privacy? Are there privacy issues related to the recording or not? And so many of those sessions, and I know educators that agree with you in terms of not wanting to record. Yet, and you also have situations where students won't put their video on, so you're teaching to squares with names or not. Or students will put on not their own names, so it's not an easy situation.
Yeah, there are challenges. The security has gotten a lot better. From the early days when that remarkable flood of users, hit Zoom, and now one of my biggest challenges is trying to figure out whether I can have an outside speaker join my class because the security settings, have been tightened up so much that takes some forethought and planning. I think there has been a pretty steady march toward improvement. That balance that Claudia is talking about, gets adjusted. Beyond that, there are problems that crop up that maybe weren't anticipated. For instance, Zoom just before Christmas of 2020, the Washington Post reported that there was a criminal complaint that was filed. It regarded a Zoom employee in China, another spin on the insider threat situation, who was working with the Chinese government and not just essentially disrupting in China communications that had subjects like Tiananmen Square that the Chinese government disliked, but also disrupting the American callers on Zoom participation in that. And to the point where the employee was making up justifications for cutting off Zoom calls with American participants, and saying that they were discussing child abuse or racism or terrorism or violence, when really they were discussing Tiananmen Square. And so that was I think, an unexpected problem. I don't know how many Zoom sessions were affected by that, but it's just another example that there are, not just insiders in terms of the students in a class, but insiders in terms of employees in Zoom. Also, I don't want to overstate that problem and say that it was widespread, but it's the kind of problem, and we've seen that with insiders, who have been able to, not in the Zoom connection, but in general, access information they shouldn't.
Yeah, and it's also important to realize the level of sensitivity in your particular video meeting. I mean, David, you're in terms of a classroom and students being able to have free and frank conversations with you about certain issues and their privacy. In a little different context, you're talking about, for example, video meetings with clients to discuss mergers and acquisitions or trade secrets or intellectual property or other sorts of sensitive things. You have to be aware of the nature of your conversation and the security that would be appropriate for those kinds of of conversations. Also, with regard to your background, how many times do you spend an hour staring at somebody's screen and wondering what books they're reading? Or what kind of secure or sensitive documents might be in front of them that you might be able to see because their camera is pointed at their desk. All kinds of issues that you need to be aware of that otherwise you don't when you're just on the phone.
I was on a call recently with a senior person from a political organization after the November 2020 elections, and she included on her list of achievements that her small children never appeared naked behind her in course of a Zoom call. And I was so impressed with the humanity and reflection of the human, condition of our times. I sent a note to a couple of my colleagues saying, that somebody had mentioned that. And the two colleagues I sent it to both replied, "I wish I could say the same." So there are a lot of aspects to background. But from a cybersecurity perspective, we also have to think about, that we're using different devices, that we're loading different things on them than, may have been the case before in a law firm or corporate environment. Sometimes we're sharing those devices with other family members. Our connections are made often over Wi-Fi networks that other family members connect other devices to. And, so apart from the service itself, if you will, the larger context in what's a home nowadays, mostly as a workplace, also can be relevant and pose certain kinds of challenges and threats. Because if your computer has, certain kinds of malware on it that could have gotten there through any of these other means, that will affect the security of the M&A call that Claudia was just talking about.
So this discussion has really made me think about how all these different aspects, they're sort of competing against each other. There's the issue of choice, privacy rights, transparency, sensitivity, or possible uses of people's personal data or personal information that they don't even realize is being shared with other people, or it's out there somehow. And so I want to ask you guys two more questions. And first, I want to ask, what would you say is the number one concern for people, either in the private sector, the public sector, any situation where they would have to use video conferencing technology? Going forward, what would be the number one thing people should sort of, look out for in terms of any of these issues? Like what's going to be our biggest thing we have to confront in the near future? Claudia, how about you?
Yeah, well, so one thing that is sort of out there lurking that we haven't seen a lot yet, but those in the cybersecurity space have been aware of for maybe 2 years now. And all these video meetings have made data rich, would be deep fakes. So that's something that we have to be really concerned about in the future, because we are all now on video. How many Zoom calls do we have a day? What is the opportunity to grab a snippet of that video and then attribute it to somebody else in a deep fake kind of way? We have our audio recordings, so the voices are there that can be. The manipulation opportunities are tremendous, and I've had other discussions on technology alone, where in the space of this pandemic, we probably have accelerated the pace of change 5 to 10 years. That things we are doing now would not have happened but for the pandemic, and that could happen maybe 5 or 10 years out. And so a lot of things are being accelerated, and I would guess the pace of change has accelerated. But deep fakes, that's an area that I think is something to really watch for.
Yeah, we're always going to have to be catching up with the speed. That's always going to be a problem. And can we catch up fast enough? David, what about you? What would you say is something like you're going to be looking out for in the near future?
I think the deep fakes example is a good one. I guess because I use Zoom for teaching, and some professors use other tools, I do think that who has access and whether and how long any of the Zoom meetings may last unexpectedly is really the biggest worry I have, that there'll be some sort of discovery. And it may be that it's a participant in the meeting, recording something and doing something with it. It may be that they don't even know that they're recording their screen in some way, that they have some sort of software on it. And maybe it's malware, maybe it's a third party doing it. But I do worry that our expectations of who we're talking to, whether or not that conversation lasts, and who has access to it, will, for one reason or another, prove false, and that we'll be surprised. But that would be my sort of worry.
All right, one final question for me, and this is kind of a wild card. What is one thing you thought you'd never be doing by video that you've now done since the start of the pandemic?
Wine tasting.
Oh.
And I held a party.
Oh.
I never really thought that I would be holding a virtual celebration.
Did
That's
a
great.
wine tasting with a vineyard in California, and it was very interesting.
Who would have thought you could have traveled to California, see relatives and friends from far away? That is, a benefit of video conferencing for sure. And I think everything you guys have highlighted is just the importance of personal responsibility for your own privacy and your own, making sure you're aware of things that are getting out there. There's a lot out of our control, but a lot in our control. And so it's important that I think we all take that personal responsibility. So before we let you go, I know we're running a bit tight on time here. I'd like, and Kayla's already asked one personal question, so I'm just going to stick with one here. I guess starting with you, David, can you tell us something interesting about yourself that we wouldn't know about you if we just knew you professionally?
I'll tell you, sure. I don't know if it's interesting, but I was a very early Billie Eilish fan before her first album came out that won all the Grammys. So I had known about her work earlier and had been following her career. And I have heard her once in concert, and I also stayed up and watched remotely some of her early stuff too, and it was available. Coachella, which is not something that anyone would necessarily associate with me. So my two favorite artists are Bruce Springsteen, which they probably would guess, and Billie Eilish, which people probably would.
Huh. Longtime fan. That's great. What about you, Claudia?
Probably most folks wouldn't know that I achieved a certification as a cross-country ski instructor, and my instructor was a silver medalist from Czechoslovakia, having escaped before the Nazis ran over Czechoslovakia.
Where's your favorite place to cross-country ski?
That would be Colorado.
Okay. Known for downhill skiing, but also apparently cross-country skiing. That's great.
Yes.
Great. So now this is our final segment, what we like to call the Curious Hat.
And now it's time for the Curious Hat.
So Claudia, I'm going to start with you. I have a virtual hat. I'm going to ask you to pick a number 1 through 25.
21.
21. Okay. What is you may have just answered this, but what is your favorite hobby?
Gosh, well now...
Virtual wine tasting.
Yeah, right there. But bicycling. I have a road bike, and I enjoy bicycling.
That's great. And you're going outdoors. You're not the Peloton joiner or Great. Okay, David, your turn. 1 through 25.
7.
7. Okay. So David, what was your very first job, or a job that you've always wanted but won't likely have in your lifetime? I'll let you answer either of those questions.
Yeah, when I was a kid, it was a real choice between whether I wanted to be an astronaut or a professional baseball player. And neither of those has happened. And I'm probably not eligible or likely to be drafted by a Major League Baseball team. So.
You could still go to space. I feel like SpaceX is making, civilian space trips possible maybe in the next decade. We will see.
Yeah, I think the price was it $22 million or $40 million?
Oh, okay.
That recent landing. I was pleased with that recent landing.
Yeah, I don't think that's going to happen. Although, they were, I may have to try to get elected to the Senate or something, right? Because they took, was it Senator Jake Garn, I think, who was much, much older than me, and John Glenn went again also as older. So I guess there are opportunities out there.
Don't lose hope, David. Well, Claudia and David, this has been a wonderful episode, very informative. Thank you again for joining today. And to all of our listenership, thank you for listening to this episode of Our Curious Amalgam.
Thank you for listening to this week's episode of Our Curious Amalgam, a competition, consumer protection, data protection, and privacy law podcast. It is produced and shared around the globe by ABA's Antitrust Law Section. The opinions expressed by the participants in this podcast are their own and do not necessarily represent their employer or other organizations. If you like what you heard or would like to become a member of the American Bar Association, please check out what the Antitrust section has to offer at ambar.org/antitrust. You can learn more about our podcast at ourcuriousamalgam.com. If you have comments, suggestions, or podcast ideas, please reach out to us at podcast@ourcuriousamalgam.com. Until next time, thank you for listening.